Right. Good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Welcome to another COPA safety seminar. This one is on winter flying. We have Ronan Court and Chris Horsten that will be presenting on winter flying and cold weather operations for Rotax aircraft. I'll let you guys introduce yourselves, Chris.
Yeah, thanks for having me. My name is Chris Horsten. I am the director of the Canadian Light Sport Aircraft Association, and we are also the owners of Sport Aircraft Canada, which is a company that markets the Shark 600 aircraft, Canardia Avionics, ESIT Waist Scales, and a number of other products to the Canadian market. And then we also represent those companies in the United States as well. So we're the North American distributors for all of those parts and planes. I think that's about it. I'm an active participant along with COPA in many of the Transport Canada safety working groups, and so we're all working together for the good of Canadian aviation safety.
Thanks, Chris. Ronan.
Yeah, I'm Ronan. I'm currently a flight instructor at Mount Royal University and also their flight safety investigator, flight safety officer. Yeah, in my free time, I'm doing a lot of GA flying lately and doing a lot of work with COPA as well, doing a lot with George on different working groups and scholarship selections and all sorts of stuff with COPA. So yeah, glad to be here.
Well, we appreciate you guys being here and spending your evening with us, and we appreciate you all joining us. There's an awful lot of you out there. I'm George Farrington. I'm the Director of External Relations with COPA, so a little bit of everything. I'll put my details in the chat. If you have any advocacy, medical, send us an email. We'll see what we can do to help. Little overview of what today's going to look like. Chris is going to start off with a little bit about Rotax 900 series cold weather operations, and following his slides, we'll have a brief Q&A. So any questions you have related to Rotax aircraft, the Shark, Canardia Avionics, anything you think Chris would be able to answer, we'll have a discussion at that point. We'll then start with the winter flying presentation with Ronan. Halfway through that, we'll have a brief 10-minute break, let you catch up, get a drink, and then following the end of that presentation, we'll have another Q&A. So we have the Q&A section. Please post your questions in there. We have the chat as well. Any questions, please put them in there. And then if it's something quick that can be answered on the fly, we'll ask it during the presentation, but most of them we'll leave to the end of the presentation. This does qualify for your current training. So I will be sending out a certificate in the next couple of days after this presentation for you to keep in your logbook, but also write the following details on this slide just to make a note that you attended. Ultimately, the presentation name, COPA Safety Seminar Winter Flying. Note that it was online, the date that you attended, and the presenter, which in this case is Ronan. Chris, we will start with you. Please let me know when you want me to move on the slides.
Okay, thanks. It looks like there's a bunch of people reporting they're having issues seeing the content. I don't know if that's still the case, but I'm getting little messages pop up on my screen here. So just in case there's something, yeah, no display here, somebody said.
Oh, okay. That's
maybe you can.
I will try and put it back up. Bear with me.
Guy just said just a gray screen. A lot of other people are saying.
Okay, let me try and
what it's worth, it was fine for me.
Let's give it a go.
Okay.
Do we have a screen?
I can see.
How are we looking in the chat?
First, yep, looks like it. Just need to get my presentation back up there.
Okay. So for anyone that didn't see, here's a brief agenda. And these are the details that you will need to put in your logbook. I will copy and paste these in the chat later on just for people to include. Here we go, Chris.
Awesome. Thanks so much. Well, it's that time of year, and I keep getting emails from my local flying club telling me what I can and can't do and what I should and shouldn't do with their airplanes. But thankfully, I'm not renting one of those, so that stuff doesn't really apply to me. But I feel sorry for the poor students who are renting, because it's pretty cold out there on the ramp, and I'm seeing them and watching them struggling with tie downs and the engine warming, the blankets going over the cowling. So not fun to do in cold weather and when it's windy. But anyway, it's got to be done because we want to protect those airplanes and we want to make sure they're safe to fly. So that's why we're here today, and we're going to talk about some of the cold weather issues for the Rotax. Some of this will apply to other engines too, so it's not just specifically for the Rotax engine series, but for any engine. So we'll just jump right in. So there's a bunch of reasons why the things that we need to know about how cold weather affects our engine. I mean, the number one thing that I think about is the oil. It doesn't want to flow when it's cold, and so you get oil that gets congealed, and it doesn't want to flow very well, and it makes engine starting a lot more difficult. But certainly that is a great argument for warming up your engine before you try to start it. But it concerns the pour point. And I don't know if you've heard that terminology before, but and that goes to the rating that you see on the bottle of oil, like a 5W50 or a 10W30 or whatever. And of course, if it's too cold, then it may be difficult for your engine to pump the oil, and more difficult for it to pump the oil. And so, it's a good idea to understand what those ratings mean. So I'll repeat this a couple times in my presentation, but the first number is the cold weather viscosity and how quickly or how easily the oil will move at a certain minimum temperature. And so I believe for a 5 rated oil, it goes to about minus 35 degrees, which sounds like a lot, and it should be fine. But with the Rotax engine, there's still a limit of minus 25 to start your engine. They don't want you really turning that thing over unless it's warmer than minus 25. I personally don't even operate my engine that cold, but of course that's up to you. And I'm sure it goes to the ultimate service life of the engine. The less damage you can do, the longer it's going to last. And starting my engine when it's warm is important to make that happen. So good to know that. The other number in the rating is how the oil flows at its normal operating temperature. So, and then the W, people say it stands for winter. So I'm not 100% sure on that, but it makes sense because it's a W. That's where we're more concerned about the flow of the oil. Cold weather adds moisture. So when you've got, cold oil in your airplane and you can't get your engine up to temperature, that moisture is accumulating, and the next thing you know, you're shutting down, and the water in the oil has not boiled off, so it's stuck in the oil cooler. It might be in the breather. It could be in the case of the Rotax, there's an oil tank, and it can freeze, and this can cause a blockage or a restriction, and that's why, like in planes like the 172, we have a winter kit. But in the Rotax, it can accumulate in the cooler, the radiator for the coolant, and block that cooler. So that's another reason we want to make sure that the engine is properly warmed up and that we achieve a certain amount of temperature during the flight that'll boil off that moisture that's caught up in the system. Cold weather reduces the output of your battery. And impedes the proper electrical operation of the starter. And a lot of new light sport airplanes and advanced ultralights are operating on tiny little lithium batteries. And they do this for weight and space savings because, they're a lot lighter than lead batteries. And but often those smaller batteries come with less cranking amps. And so in certain conditions, they may be good for maybe 2 or 3 solid attempts before they start to diminish their capacity. So this also brings to light the question: is your electrical system up to snuff? Because a lot of planes will have some kind of parasitic draw on the battery over time. So if your plane's been sitting for a few weeks and it's cold, and now you suddenly want to jump in and fly it, you may find that the engine's turning over a lot slower than it should. In fact, the Rotax engine, I believe, needs about 250 RPM to catch. So if you're going slower than that, then your engine may not start at all. So here's another one. Fuel doesn't vaporize well in cold weather, and it hinders the starting process. If you use a low quality fuel, for example, if you don't use the proper octane rating, there's other additives in the lower octanes. That stuff can build up in your carburetor jets and impede the flow of fuel. So there's another a possible problem that the fuel doesn't get vaporized well enough. And I'm going to talk about the difference between summer and winter fuel in a little bit as it applies to vapor lock, because I have a great story about that. But keep that on the burner for now. Ignition systems don't work well in cold conditions, or as well. And that goes back to the condition of the battery and if your engine's turning over fast enough. But it also goes to your ignition system. Are your plugs gapped properly? You may not get the intended spark you were expecting, and that might not matter when it's warm, but when it's cold, all these things get exacerbated. Ethanol in your fuel. Ethanol attracts and holds water. And so a lot of people who are running Rotax engines are burning MoGas. And so there's ethanol in that now, and it's getting harder and harder to find it without. And so with ethanol in there, there's a greater amount of water accumulating. And so, again, we want to make sure that we get our engines up to temperature so we can burn that off. Another question would be, are you testing your fuel to see what the ethanol concentration is? There's some very easy ways you can do that. There's some tools, you can buy them on Amazon or Aircraft Spruce or whatever for 10 or 20 bucks, and a little procedure where you take some fuel and you mix it with water, and then you can see what the concentration is. But another concern now is, now that we have pretty much ethanol in all fuel, even the high test fuel, there's been some stories circulating that some operators of a gas station may cheat and put regular fuel in the premium tanks, because it's harder to tell. Before you could tell by checking the ethanol content, but now that there's ethanol across the board, you may find that doesn't work anymore, and so you need another method to check. So I'm not suggesting that everybody out there is ripping us off and selling us regular fuel in their premium tanks, but there has been a couple of instances or stories about people who did check this and found that they had regular gas instead of premium. So make sure you trust your supplier and use a well respected and well-known fuel supplier. Oxygenated fuel, which goes to ethanol in the fuel, burns leaner. So this is a factor when you've got cold, dense air, requires a richer mixture for a better operation of the engine. Carb heat can help enrich in the mixture. We know that from our 172 days as well in Lycoming and Continental engines. But in the Rotax, we have an altitude compensating carburetor, and we don't have a mixture control. But by having carb heat on, you can artificially sort of enrich in the mixture on the Rotax. And for many people, they run in the winter with their carb heat on all the time. In fact, I know some planes where the carb heat is on all the time, even in the summer, and it runs a little bit richer, but that's how their systems are set up, and it works just fine. They might lose a little bit of the power, but the engine doesn't suffer for it. Engine oil. Wanted to talk about the engine oil. So Rotax has a new engine oil. Thanks, George, for moving the slides along there. They are no longer recommending the Sport Plus 4. It's not that they don't want you to use it. You can use up what you've got, but now they have a new oil they're recommending called APS, full synthetic, and it's got a 5W50 rating. So again, we'll go back to the 5 means the viscosity of when the oil is cold, and the top number of when it's operating at operating temperature. So that new engine oil is a little bit more expensive. I looked it up. It's about $330 for a case versus $273 for a case of the old Sport Plus 4. And it's a full synthetic oil. It is designed for both MoGas and avgas, which we can burn in the Rotax as well. So leaded applications, although MoGas is the preferred. XPS is claimed to have a low operating temperature performance due to its, or a better low operating temperature performance due to its wide operating range, which is great. And so it flows more easily in the cold, but it maintains its viscosity at its operating temperature. It's also said to have a better protection of your gearbox components, and that's because MoGas has additives that will, and other oils will have other additives that can wash away the oil too easily from your gearbox components. So this oil will keep oil attached to those components, and so obviously keep them lubricated, but also keep them from getting corroded if there's moisture in your system. So so that's good to know. Unfortunately, it means more money, but I think over time you're going to see the Sport Plus 4 being phased out and no longer available. Similar to the spark plugs that Rotax no longer supports from NGK. Now you got to buy their spark plugs for an absolute fortune. By the way, you need to change your plugs twice as often when you're running avgas in your Rotax engine. So that is a real sting if you're changing those plugs out at 100 hours. Okay, so preheating. Believe it or not, there are some pitfalls to preheating your engine. The first one is that if your oil is not rated for the conditions you're flying in, and you preheat your engine, you may think it's warm enough, but the oil may not be, and so you may not get that starting experience that you're expecting, even though you've had your plane sitting on some kind of a preheat for hours and hours. So a good preheat is required, and it may take 24 hours depending on how cold it is outside. If you're storing your plane out there, it may take quite a while for it to get up to temperature. And then you've got to be careful that when you disconnect that preheat system, that the temperature doesn't drop below its rated viscosity, where the viscosity is good, before you get the engine started again. And that can happen pretty fast, believe it or not, because there's the wind is blowing and it just robs the heat away from the engine very, very quickly. So I also recommend when you're starting when you're warming up your engine, you cover up your prop, especially if you have a metal prop, because that will take away heat. It's a huge heat conductor. It'll take away heat from the engine very quickly as well. So don't do it too quickly. Make sure it's well insulated while the heater's going, and make sure that you give it an ample amount of time to heat up before you try to start the engine. So some suggestions for proper preheating: use a preheater that works slow enough to penetrate the intersections of the engine before causing any other heat issues with the preheat. Allow some time before you start up for the preheater to work, like 5 to 8 hours may be required. If you have Wi-Fi, if you have a hangar and you have a Wi-Fi, you can now, tell your heater to come on, whatever time you need before you get there, or you can even have your furnace come on in the hangar. These are, easy to do. I've just done that with my furnace in my hangar now, so I can turn it on the night before, and so I know the next morning it's nice and toasty when I get there. So yeah, a lot of airports now are having Wi-Fi around the airport, as well as available in your hangar if you have that available to you. I have a radiant heat. Your experience may differ with forced air or of in-floor, but in terms of the time. But radiant heat, I find, takes me about 6 to 12 hours to get everything toasty in the hangar, including the airplane. Make sure you use a a preheater that doesn't cause damage to other parts of your plane, like, if you have a composite airplane or a fabric covered airplane, that you're not doing damage to any of those other surfaces. Something else that's come to light recently is tie wraps. A lot of people have tie wrap, people have Rotax powered airplanes. They tend to use a lot of tie wraps under the cowling, and those tie wraps can get soft. So just make sure that you're not directing heat over anything that's vulnerable in that way. And the other side of that is tie wraps can also be quite abrasive, and they can cut into the coatings on your engine mount. They can cut into hoses and whatnot. So it's good to have some kind of sacrificial piece of rubber or something between them and whatever the surface is underneath. That was something we had come out of the service bulletin on our Sharks, actually, that they wanted us to get some distance between the tie wrap and the engine mount, because they do wear into the engine mount. Okay, yeah, the kinds of heaters you can use. So there are, for Rotax engine owners, there are heaters. I think there's one on the screen right now that shows a built-in system. I have this system on one of our aircraft, and it works very, very well. It heats the oil tank, it heats the bottom of the engine, and it heats each of the cylinders, and pretty much captures everything except the gearbox. I think in my case, I'm not sure if there's a gearbox one, but it's enough to have the engine or the oil warmed up so that the that warm oil will get to your gearbox, fairly quickly and heat that up as well. Obviously there's other types that blow hot air into the engine, but this kind is obviously the preferred one. Let me just move along here in my notes. So, some people have a lot of problems starting their engine, and some people have no problems starting their engine in the cold. And so sometimes we'll say this is due to the idiosyncrasies of the engine, or, we have to ask the question, is it due to the shortcomings of the operator? So there's different reasons. So if you have an engine that's hard to start in warm weather, then, cold weather is only going to make it worse. So, I say don't blame the weather. There's probably some problem in your system that's got to be fixed. So, try to troubleshoot that before you get into the winter months, and make sure that everything is the way it should be, and that you've eliminated any hard starting problems while it's warm, and not during the cold months, where you're just going to end up doing more damage and putting a lot of stress on your starter and your battery. So there's been a suggestion you can use a booster battery to overcome, a weak battery. That's a little problematic in the winter, again, especially if you're outside. Obviously that, becomes a safety issue. It's a bit hazardous to do that, but it is okay to use a boost battery to get an engine running, and then deal with a battery issue later on if you have to. Just be careful with the prop. Obviously, you don't want to get caught up in the prop or any of your booster cables or whatever you're using, but it can be done. One thing to be aware of if you're using a lithium battery is those lithium batteries sometimes don't like to be charged or boosted with like a lead acid. So just know what your battery is capable of and what is allowed to be done with it before jumping it with a high amp boost. You can change the gap in your spark plug, all according to what the manual permits. But by reducing the gap to its minimum, you can help your engine catch quicker and start quicker if you have issues. But you may need to look at things like the ignition wires if they're old, and spark plugs and spark plug caps to make sure that those things are all in top-notch condition before the winter kicks in. Another good thing to look at is the grounds in your airplane. Make sure your grounds are all good and there's no corrosion. Sometimes a weak ground can cause a starting issue that, again, when it's cold out, just get exacerbated and means you can't start your engine at all. You might need to buy avgas if you're in a Rotax and you are unable to find some MOGAS that's less than 10%. So the current allowance from Rotax is you can have up to 10% of ethanol, but some gas stations are going up to 15. So if that's the case, you need to be prepared to use avgas. and then follow the maintenance schedule for the avgas use. You can mix those two. It's not against the rules to mix one with the other. If you switch back, soon enough, then you could probably avoid some of those excessive intervals for maintenance. But generally, if you switch over to avgas for any period of time, then you need to start looking at, switching out your plugs and so on at the 100-hour mark. So here's some suggestions for improving your starting. Again, make sure your plugs are clean and changed out at proper intervals. 100 hours again for avgas, 200 hours for MOGAS. The carb setup is important. So, you have to make sure that the starting carb is functioning properly, because is not effective when the throttle is fully open on the Rotax. Some people will advance the throttle and try to start the engine that way for an easier start, but then the starting carb is not as effective. So it's a good idea to make sure that starting carb is working perfectly before the winter sets in, and then you don't need to use a wide open throttle, which is less safe anyway. And you need to make sure that the actuators, opening on both actuators are moving perfectly well for both carbs, not just one carb. You've got two carbs on the Rotax. There are some modifications that people make to their, in terms of their starting jets. So you can change the starting jet in the float bowl, and that can help with cold weather starting. There is an instruction on that from Rotax that you can look up and do that. I would suggest you get help with that from somebody who knows a Rotax engine and the carburetor system well, because it's not something you really want to mess with if you're not familiar with the process. And then again, you need to have at least 250 RPM, like I said earlier, to fire the ignition system. And of course, if you have a low, weak battery, then it's not going to be able to spin it fast enough, and it's not going to start. Now, another thing to look at is your carb filters. They might look good, but are they? And you usually can, if you look around the circumference of the filter, you'll see that maybe one side is darker than the other side. It depends where it's pulling the air from, but they should be uniform all the way around. If they're clean, they will be. And they'll be a slight purple color. And if they look dark, then probably they're blocked up where the dark area is and not getting all the airflow that the engine needs. So cleaning them at recommended intervals is a good way to make sure you're getting the proper airflow. You can buy a service kit you can buy them from a hardware store, like an automotive supply house. You can buy them from K&N. You can get them from Rotax, Aircraft Spruce. There's a lot of places they'll sell you a kit for cleaning and oiling the carb filters. Sorry. Now, for in-flight cold weather flying. So, I mentioned about boiling off moisture in the oil. Maintaining your oil temperature and exceeding the boiling point at least once during the flight is paramount. So if you fly all winter and your oil temperature never goes above, the boiling point for water, you're never going to boil off that moisture completely, and it's going to sit in your system, possibly accumulate in your oil cooler, and then freeze. So really important to get that temperature up to 100 degrees and not risk getting that coolant accumulate. Or sort of say the water to accumulate, not coolant. So the coolant system is less important in the Rotax than the oil system. There's no minimum coolant temperature in flight other than to make sure that the coolant flows. So it's good to just keep that part as simple as possible. But if you heat your cabin with coolant, then it's a good idea to have some kind of a thermostat so that it can keep the coolant temperature at a certain level before it allows that coolant to flow into the cabin and become too cool. Again, there's no minimum, but it's a good idea to keep it at a reasonable level so that the heads of your engine are not getting too cool. Now there is a company called France Aircraft, FRANZ, that makes some of these thermostat systems. I went and looked them up. I had a website URL, but it doesn't work. So if you just Google France Aircraft, FRANZ-aircraft, you'll find them on the internet. They've got a whole bunch of Rotax parts, but they have those thermostat systems, and there's a bunch of different ones you can buy. You can also put a thermostat in to maintain your oil temperature. So that's another biggie. It helps with warming up your engine a little quicker, and then maintaining and managing your oil temperature over the course of the flight. So if you haven't already got a oil thermostat in your Rotax powered airplane, then consider adding one of those if you plan to do a lot of winter flying. It'll save your engine. The other thing people do for in-flight, to maintain their temperatures is they'll cover the coolers. So you have an oil cooler and you have the radiator for the coolant. So you can cover those. You need to experiment a little bit unless there's a known amount of area that needs to be covered. You got to be careful if you're doing it from scratch and experiment with that in terms of how much coverage is necessary, because you don't want to overheat the engine. And then one of the things a lot of manufacturers do, they'll stack the oil cooler on top of the coolant radiator. And so then if you cover one, you may actually be blocking the other one, and you may get some disproportionate heating. And so your oil temperature might be, where you want it to be, but the coolant might be boiling over. So you've got to be careful when you put that coverage over the coolers, just to make sure that you don't overheat the other one. The other thing you can do is have a cowl flap or a shutter system. Some people have developed their own. There are some systems available out there if you Google it. Sometimes the manufacturer includes them, but make sure you know how to use it. We know of one case where the customer thought that they were just closing it up in the winter and then opening it up in the summer, and unfortunately had it closed and overheated the engine and damaged some cylinders as a result. So just make sure you know that it's to be used as per the need, as opposed to seasonally. Another great thing to do with a Rotax is to insulate the oil tank, because that tank radiates a lot of the heat out. And so again, this is something you need to experiment with, because you don't want all the heat to remain. You don't want to overheat it, but you can put some insulation around the oil tank and retain the heat a little better if you need to. And then with the carb heat, some manufacturers, like I said earlier, have it on all the time. Some of them have a summer and a winter setting. So you can just turn a little valve and it'll allow coolant to flow through a jacket in the carburetor, and that is on all the time. So for example, in our Shark, we have that. We turn it on in the winter, and the carb heat is on for the entire season. And then in the summer, we turn it off. Carb heat or carb icing is not as common in Rotax engines. It does happen, but because of the carbs being at the back of the engine on top, that seems to be an area of the engine cowling that stays fairly warm. And so icing isn't usually an issue back there, but it depends on your airplane. So if you have it, use it. It also keeps the carb warm, and that may contribute to your linkages and your parts moving a little better and not getting frozen up if they're cold. So having them at a better closer to operating temperature that you see in the summer, if you can get it, will make those parts move more freely. So vapor lock. I wanted to talk about vapor lock because this is something that happened to me the end of last season, and it scared the heck out of me because I wasn't expecting it, and it really opened my eyes because I started doing some research about vapor lock and what are the causes, and the fact that it happened to me just on the edge of spring, so still technically winter out, and yet here we are, and I'm on the runway, and I've done a run up according to the Rotax run up schedule, which is up to 4,000 and then 4,500 for our prop cycling, and everything checked out perfectly well. taxied onto the runway, poured on the power, and the engine just bogged down. And so I taxied off, went back to the run-up circle, and did another successful run-up, and everything seemed fine. Back out to the runway, poured on the power, and again it happened, except this time my engine actually failed. And so it just shut off. And here I am sitting like actually I wasn't on the runway yet. I was just on the taxiway. I wanted to make sure before I got on the runway that I wasn't going to do it again. So I'd done another run up there. And so waited a little while, tried to start the engine up again. It was running a little rough, and couldn't figure out what was going on, because surely it wasn't vapor lock, because it was pretty cool out still. And then anyway, eventually another airplane came along down the taxiway. I had to get out of the way. So, I told him what I was doing, and I jumped out, and I was able to push the plane out of the way so the other planes could get in the air. And then it was that call over to ground ops and the tow of shame back to my hangar, with me sitting on the wing. And yeah, it's kind of embarrassing when you're getting towed back to your hangar in a brand new airplane and everybody's looking at you saying, what's wrong with that thing? Anyway, we were able to download all of the data log for the engine, and we started looking at all the parameters, and sure enough, we have 2 temperature sensors under the cowling in our plane, because vapor lock can be a problem. It's a very tightly cowled engine, and so if you have a tightly cowled engine, vapor lock can occur even in the winter if it gets too hot. And one of those temperature sensors is on just inside the cowl for, we call it engine compartment temperature. And the other one is heat shrink to a fuel line, so we can check the temperature of the fuel. And so both of those, in my case, indicated that I was in the vapor lock regime with, now, I don't know if you know about this, but there is such a thing called summer gas and winter gas. And if you've got winter gas in your airplane and you're infringing into warmer weather, into spring, you may end up with a vapor lock issue. So the way that the winter gas works is they add butane to the fuel, and that allows the fuel to evaporate much quicker. So, and that's exactly what we don't want in warm weather, because then that becomes a gas and it's not flowing, and then we get vapor lock. So the fuel that I had been using up to that point was winter fuel, and I was making sure that I did a really good solid run up and warm up, because the plane had been in for maintenance. And so, first flights, I wanted to make sure everything was good. So I warmed it up really, diligently, but it was so warm that fuel caused me to get a vapor lock situation. So I jumped over to avgas in a hurry, because I was just about to head south, and I certainly didn't want to have any issues with a vapor lock as I head south to Florida. And I've been on it ever since. So now I'm going back to MoGas again, because it's obviously better for the engine. But that experience really made me do my homework and learn a bit more about the difference between summer and winter gas, and the possibility of having vapor lock, that it does exist even in the winter if you get your engine warm enough and you've got that specific fuel in there. So what am I going to get some other notes here about that? So some of the newer Rotax engines, especially the 915s and the 916s, they have even more demanding heat management requirements than the 912 series engines. So if you've got a 915 or 916, that's even more problematic. And vapor lock can occur in fuel injected engines as well. A lot of people like to think that, oh, I can't get vapor lock, I got a fuel injected. It can. And so be aware of that. Even in a fuel injected engine, if you get hot enough, you may be evaporating the fuel. Usually it happens right on top of the engine in the lines going to the cylinders, but for the Rotax 912 series, it can happen even before it gets to the carburetor, depending on where the hoses are routed. So good to know. And then I wanted to talk about Yes, compromised placement of oil and oil coolers and radiators. So I already mentioned that you can, impact one area of cooling negatively by blocking the other one if they're stacked. But some manufacturers don't have a choice in terms of where they put. There's only so much space to put an oil cooler or the radiator, and that's especially true now with the 915s and the 916s because they have, again, much more demanding engine heat management. So, as far as the placement of those two things go, those can also and have been shown to contribute to vapor lock as well, depending on where the fuel lines go in relation to where those coolers are. It gets pretty hot. And you don't want to burn off your coolant, so you don't want it to get too hot, and you don't want, obviously, to overheat your engine and, the resulting damage that comes from that. And I guess the other thing that's important, especially in the winter, anytime, but in the winter you might not notice it because it's so cold, but there's been a service bulletin recently about a bad welds on the pressure bottle, for the coolant bottle, and Rotax. The reason this became known is because a Rotax 915 powered airplane lost its coolant, and you'd think that you could go for a little while, especially in the winter, but this engine was destroyed in about 2 hours. And this customer was only flying his engine or his airplane home, and it was about 2 hours of flying time. He figured he could go the rest of the way, but he ended up destroying the engine as a result. So that's not all to do with vapor lock, but to do with those service bulletins anyway. And there are service bulletins about temperature management in those engines that you want to stay on top of. So that was our experience with the vapor lock. And I've seen, and in dealing with that, I've heard and seen from other people some of their experiences too. And so it's not an uncommon thing with the Rotax, and it doesn't have to be Rotax, can be any engine, but it's not an uncommon thing, even in the winter, to be able to get vapor lock. So do make sure that that you're watching which fuel you're using in your airplane. If it's MoGas, there is a winter fuel, and it does have more propensity to evaporate quicker in the fuel lines when it gets hot. So that is roughly it for me. I'm going to just summarize here a little bit, and then we'll do some Q&A. Number one, be aware of all the dangers that go with cold weather flying and how it affects your engine. The stuff we've talked about. Know what your manual says in your POH and your AFM and whatever, what it says about winter operations. If there's things you need to do, make sure you do them. Winter flying requires that you do stuff before you fly, and it kind of takes the fun out of it, especially if you're out in the cold doing it. But, resist the temptation to just jump into your plane and go. There's stuff you got to do to stay safe and to make your plane last longer and be safer to fly. So don't just run and jump in and go. Take the time to heat it up, preheat it, and then warm it up before you fly. If you can, store your plane in a heated hangar. That's the best way to go. I know that's not always feasible, but if you have access to a hangar in the winter, a lot of people take their planes south and their hangars are sitting empty. So I know they're available to rent, even if it's just for the winter season. Not a bad idea to do that, or to share one with somebody. Don't start a Rotax below minus 25 degrees Celsius. Make sure you preheat that engine up thoroughly before you try to start that engine up. Otherwise, you're going to do damage. And make sure your engine gets to 100 degrees for at least 30 minutes during every flight to burn off any moisture that's accumulated in the oil. Use a good quality oil. If you're not using the Sport Plus 4, then use the new synthetic oil that they've recommended. I hear a lot of people talking about other oils they use, motorcycle oil or whatever, but these things might be okay in the short term, but there's other properties that go to the gearbox that are important in making sure that those other components that are not directly inside the engine are looked after properly, and you may not be getting those benefits, or you may be getting detrimental effects from using those types of oils that don't look after your gearbox properly. So, use the recommended oil from the manufacturer if you want to make your engine last a long time. And that goes to its value too. Like a well-documented Rotax engine, an airplane will have a higher resale value one day than one that doesn't. And make sure your oil temps are in the green before you run up. Very important. Make sure you get to that minimum temperature before you do your run up, and then again before taking off. So that's pretty much it for me. If you've got some questions, by all means, put them in the chat, and George will let us know what those questions are. I'll try to answer them here. If not, I can make a note of them and get back to you if you want to share information about where I can reach you. Happy to look up the answers for you and help you out.
Thank you, Chris. That was excellent. We've had a couple of requests for the recurrency slide, so I'm just going to put this up for a couple more minutes for people, and then we will move on to questions. I'll start with one. Can you give more details of carb heat for carbureted Rotax engines over the years? I've heard of various types such as hot water jacket using coolant, electric heat, and warm air from both exhaust shroud and warm cowl air. What say you?
Yeah, there are a whole variety of ways. The electric ones I haven't seen a lot lately. They used to have a ceramic probe that screwed into the side of the carburetor. One of the challenges with that is it's a very high draw in terms of the electrical demand, and 912s have a limited amount of capacity from the alternator, generator, whatever you want to call it. And I think it's about 30 amps. And with the planes that we are seeing today and all the systems in them, even our Shark, for example, with the avionics, you've got a retractable landing gear that uses electric servos, flat motors, trim motors, autopilots, lighting systems. It all adds up. And so those electrical things become a little bit problematic when you've got them all running at the same time. Even pitot heat we have on the Shark as well. The water jacket seems to be the most common and easy to do. It's just basically a jacket that goes in between the carburetor and the intake manifold, and the coolant flows into that jacket and warms up the airflow going into the carburetor, and that works very well. You can, again, on the Shark, we can turn it on and off, but on our former Bushcat, it was on all the time, and it was the same kind of system. There's different manufacturers. Some of them are machined out of a block of aluminum. Some of them are a casting with some kind of a copper tube inside carrying the coolant. And then, of course, there's the hot air method, which works equally well depending on the airplane you've got. If you've got the space for that, then great, because there's a plenum you can get that goes instead of the normal filters that we usually see. Some of them have a plenum, and you can get hot air into that from the exhaust to heat your carburetor. Answer your question?
That's I think so. Oh, we have another one here from Craig. Crankcase vent hose modification, i.e., a whistle hole, is added safety measure due to possible frosted up blockage in end of vent tube. What say you?
I haven't come across that modification. I think the Rotax has other ways of venting the crankcase. Before you start drilling into your crankcase, I would talk to Rotax about that. That sounds to me more like a Lycoming Continental thing. I honestly haven't seen that. If you have a picture of that or a kit or an instruction, I'd be interested in seeing that. If you want to share, whoever asked that, I would be interested in seeing more details about that.
Excellent. I will put your email in the chat, Chris, for anyone that has any questions for you on Rotax, Shark, any of that sort of stuff. I'm just having a look. I think that's it. If I've missed anything, please add it to the chat, and we can ask a little later. Ronan, over to you.
Sure. Thanks, George. Just real quick while I'm getting my slides up here, if people could put in the chat where they're coming from today. where they're sitting, where they're joining this meeting from. Uh, Um, okay, you see my slides up there, George?
I do indeed. We've got a lot of answers all over.
Couple Calgary locals, awesome.
Got an Airdrie. I like it.
Invermere, done a lot of flying out of Invermere on the gliders. Lethbridge, Florida, someone's lucky.
Yeah, a few Floridas. You're a lot warmer than we are. Or I don't know, there's snow down there apparently.
I did see a video of some snow on Venice Beach this morning.
This presentation is applicable to Florida as well, I guess.
Might be the one time the whole year that we can present winter flying in Florida.
Excellent. Cold Lake. Are you flying anything a little bit more interesting? Let us know. All over. Got a white horse.
All over. Yeah, Whitehorse
We got
very
we, we got an Australia. I don't know what the time zone is
Australia.
there, but my goodness, thanks for tuning in.
Must be 2 in the morning.
Yeah. Awesome.
Cool.
Well, Ronan, over to you. We'll do a break about halfway through. I'll join and everyone can have a little bit of a 10-minute break. But yeah, same thing. Any questions, put them in Q&A, put them in the chat, and we'll answer them at the end.
Sure. I will be tuning in and out of the chat through the presentation so I can pick up any questions as they're applicable to the slides I'm on. Cool. So I asked where everyone's coming from because, as we know, Canada being the second largest country in the world, we get a lot of variation across our country in weather patterns. Even between areas in the same province, lower mainland of BC versus northern BC, you get a lot of different weather. Thanks to Chris for the presentation on engines. We'll be presenting a little bit on engine considerations, but more so on pre-flight and emergency planning as well. So like I introduced, I'm currently a flight instructor for Mount Royal University. I'm also their assistant flight safety officer, so I handle a lot of our internal investigations. In my free time, I am a Coursera pilot, which is where these slides come from. I'm currently working on my pilot certification, but I'm a navigator and spotter for them currently. I also do a little bit of freelance instructing in the Calgary area and a little bit of consulting for other aviation companies, mostly online ground school providers. When I say I fly in Canada, when I'm talking to pilots from the States or elsewhere in the world, when I say I fly in Canada, they often assume that in the middle of July I'm landing on an ice strip. And as that can be true in a lot of areas of the country, like I said, we get a lot of variation in our weather. We don't like the cold. Our planes don't like the cold. Flying in winter weather can be a lot different than in the summer. Piston airplanes especially are particularly prone to aging, as we were talking about with the engines in particular. Flying cold can, if you're not doing it correctly, it can shorten your TBOs. As much as the plane hates it, we also hate pre-flighting in the minus temperatures. I think southern Saskatchewan last week got down to minus 40 something, and even Texas this week got down to -2. There are a lot of benefits to winter flying. Get a lot more performance out of the airplane, not just the engine, but the wing makes a lot more performance in the colder, denser air as well. A lot less thermal turbulence, obviously, without the daytime heating that we experience in the summer. A lot less thunderstorms prevalent. With low humidity and cold air over the winter, we can get a lot more visibility. But for those IFR pilots in the group, obviously a lot more icing as well. So today we'll go over a little bit of flight preparations, both for you and the airplane. A little bit of cold weather operations, talk about some effects of the cold on the aircraft and the performance instrumentation. A little bit of winter weather review, some icing involved in that, and then we'll end out with what happens when your flight turns into an impromptu camping trip. In terms of preparing for the flight, obviously what comes first to mind is the airplane and making sure it's prepared for the winter flying, making sure you're not iced up, making sure your engine's preheated, as Chris talked about. But this also discusses being prepared for the flight itself in terms of routing, the possibility of an off-airport landing, how you're dressed for the flight, There's one airline pilot I follow quite closely that says, "Don't dress for where you're going, dress for where you're flying." So coming out of Calgary, going down to Cancun, or even out to Vancouver, worst comes to worst, you could be spending the night on top of a very, very cold, very, very snowy mountain. Also, what you want to consider is the contents of your emergency kit and how well you know that emergency kit. We'll talk about that in a little bit, but if you have one of those pre-bought, purpose-built aviation survival kits, often they are so packed in with contents that you can't really open it and explore what's in the kit, which can cause some issues, as well as your own fitness to fly. Cold can affect us in a lot of ways, but we'll talk about that a little bit later on. A lot of pilots are familiar with their area that we fly in. So I'm very familiar with kind of the winter conditions that happen around Calgary, and all of the winter weather that can be associated with that. But let's say that we're flying, even 100 miles. You can encounter an entirely different weather pattern, a lot different picture, and a lot different landscape than you're used to flying out of your local area. Flight planning during the winter months requires a lot of special knowledge, not just in your local area, the weather that you're going to encounter in the route, but also knowledge in your aircraft and your ability. And knowing that aircraft and your ability, you should be taking extra precautions as you see fit. In terms of winter flying, try and follow IFR, and I don't mean instrument flight rules, I mean I follow roads. Not only does it give you a verifiable landmark to follow for the duration of your flight, it'll also give you a suitable landing site. And a lot of times where there's roads, there's people. So in this photo here, if you landed on the left and right of the road, even if you're only 100 feet off the road or so, could be quite a hike up one of those hills to get up to the road and see some people. But if you have a suitable stretch of road that you're following that you could use as a landing site, then not only is it a good landing site, but it's also a good surviving site. You, as the pilot, have the complete responsibility of the no-go decision. And you got to use that on the best information available. Don't let compulsion take the place of best judgment. I tell my students often about the get there-itis, and I must fly today. I must get to my destination today. And when I go plan a trip, say I'm flying out to the Lower Mainland for a little weekend trip, I make a habit of not giving myself a reason to get there today. So I book no hotel room, I book no rental car, I make no plans for the night, even a dinner plan with a friend in Vancouver. That would give me a little bit of a temptation to get there today. And oftentimes that temptation could be enough. Just having dinner booked with a friend at your destination could be enough to get you into that get there-itis mindset, and you must leave the airport today. There's no such thing as an emergency takeoff, only emergency landings. So don't force yourself into an emergency takeoff. In terms of getting you and your passengers ready, you want to make sure that you've done your I'm safe checklist, and we'll talk about that in a minute here as well. Make sure that you're wearing your weather-appropriate clothing. So at work, we have a policy that below -7, we wear snow pants in the aircraft. You don't have to wear your whole snowsuit and park and everything, but below -7, you must wear your snow pants in the aircraft at my operator. Make sure that you have checked your weather and planned a suitable route, not just any route. Don't go direct over the top if you're flying through the mountains. Make sure you planned a suitable route. I'm safe. We're going back into a little bit of PPL ground school stuff here, but you want to make sure that you are able to function appropriately as pilot in command. So back to the last slide there. I, standing for illness, you want to make sure that you are not currently or about to be experiencing any illness, even just a simple cold, a little bit of sinus congestion. If you climb 1,000 feet, that could cause you a lot of problems. If you're taking any medication that's not approved by your CAME, that'll also affect your ability to fly. And a lot of times, especially when I'm talking to students, if they've taken Advil or something, there generally isn't a lot of side effects that happen with most over-the-counter medication. But those side effects that you aren't expecting, say you take Advil and you're just for aches or something, there could be some personal connection there where you have a specific reaction to that medicine. So even though you're not anticipating a side effect, you don't want to be experiencing a surprise side effect while you're flying. Any abnormal stress factors, obviously we all experience some amount of stress, and that normal amount of stress across the board can vary from person to person. But you want to make sure that you're not experiencing any excess stress or any abnormal stress. If that's personal problems at home or work stresses, or that I get their itis could also fall under the stress time constraint. You want to make sure that you are mentally fit to fly as well as physically. In terms of alcohol, the reg, I'm tempted to say recently, but I don't think it was that recently that it was updated to 12 hours from 8 hours. So it is now 12 hours from your time of last drink. And it's a 24 recommended if you've had an excessive amount. Good night out at the bar. In terms of fatigue, again, similar to stress, our baseline for fatigue changes person to person. If I ask George what his baseline for minimum rest, he might say 4 hours, where I'm a little bit more towards the 12-hour mark for proper rest. Even if you had a good night's rest, say you slept a good 8 hours and you didn't wake up throughout the night, you're feeling pretty good when you wake up. If you're flying at 5 p.m. that day, that good night's rest could be too far gone for you to properly function. In terms of eating, a lot of people laugh when I say eating. Proper nutrition. This isn't just did you eat today, this is how have you been eating in the last while. If you've been living off bags of chips for the last week, probably not properly fed for that flight. You also want to be well fed before the flight, not only in terms of your cognitive ability. Obviously, we all get the hangry sometimes. But if that flight turns into an impromptu camping trip, you might not have food readily available. So you want to be able to last throughout at least the duration of the flight without having a snack. And then winter flying wear. Obviously, I think it's about 0 - 1 here in Calgary today, not shorts weather. You want to be wearing a coat, gloves. You might want to consider either wearing or carrying snow pants on board. You also want to be wearing appropriate footwear. It's very easy to say, yeah, I'm going for a 1 hour flight out of Springbank out into the mountains, go for a little scenic flight. But if you're wearing your sandals on that flight, then that camping trip is going to be a lot more difficult. Not just for you, but also any passenger that you're carrying. You want to be mindful of the liability that you're carrying in your aircraft, and a poor dressed passenger could increase that liability as well on that camping trip, where you are now responsible for keeping them warm on top of keeping them alive. Winter weathers vary drastically across provinces, even through the course of a day in one location. This morning when I woke up, it was relatively sunny here. Now I'm looking out my window. It's clear again, but over the noon hour today, we had a little bit of overcast. Don't be lured into adverse weather by a good pilot report. Important thing to remember when filing a PIREP or reading a PIREP is that the condition you're reporting is subject to the aircraft experiencing that condition. So light turbulence out of a 737's PIREP could be moderate or severe for a 172. So don't place too much, what's the word I'm looking for there? Don't read too much into it in terms of, oh, it's just light turbulence. But if that aircraft was a 777 reporting light turbulence, that could be more severe for your aircraft. Near large bodies of water, this is more for the Great Lakes region, but even in BC, you have quite extensive lakes. You can deal with highly localized weather due to that added moisture from the lake, and that might not show up in a weather report that's 20 miles away from that lake. So keep in mind the terrain you're flying over and what weather that terrain could be making. Flying out of Calgary into the lower mainland, you're going from we're sitting between 3,000 and 4,000 feet here in Calgary into Vancouver, where you're at sea level. And anywhere in between, you could have up to 11,000 feet or down to 4,000 feet in the valleys. So you could be seeing clouds along the peak levels or fog in the valleys. So yeah, keep in mind what weather factors wouldn't be included in the reports. Setting up a winter-friendly route can be important. If you're traveling over highly populated areas, the risk of finding yourself in a winter survival situation can be minimal. But a lot of Canada's wilderness, And even flying in Alberta, obviously we got a lot of houses spread out over the countryside with all the acreages and farms out there. But if you just happen to pick the field to land in that's just a little bit too far from that one house, you could end up in a bit of a sticky situation. So plan a route that keeps you close to a better chance for recovery, not just survival, but put yourself in a good position, keep yourself findable. Staying close to highways is a good strategy. Vehicles traveling on those roads offer good visual clues regarding to what may lie ahead, especially at night. You could be getting a little bit of information of what you see in the car's headlights. But as fast as I say, stay close to highways. If you can't stay close to the highway, you got to find a way to get close to the highway. There was a helicopter crash out near Revelstoke. I want to say that was last July, maybe 2 Julys ago now, where the pilot ended up in the tree line a couple 100 feet from the Trans-Canada, and he was unfindable in the dense trees. Unfortunately, that was a recovery, not a rescue, and he was found a couple 100 meters just to the north of the highway. But the tree line was so thick that no one could see the helicopter or the post-crash fire that occurred. He ended up being found by air a couple of days later. Now, preparing the airplane, a lot of light aircraft have what's called winter fronts or baffling or winter covers. Be familiar with your POH and your aircraft to understand what your manufacturer requires. Again, at my current operation, we have winter fronts that we install below -7, and those basically restrict the airflow into the cylinders to ensure that the engine is keeping sufficient heat without the ram air cooling it down too much. Sometimes this could be a modification on your oil cooler. It could be a modification to your air inlets, but make sure, A, that you understand your aircraft and its POH and what it requires, but also understand how that's installed and how to verify that's installed properly. As you're looking at a baffle at the front of your airplane, if it's missing a screw, that could make a bad day worse. Oil, the last presentation gave some good information on oil, but make sure you're using the proper grade in your aircraft. A lot of us will swap oils between summer and winter, which is smart to do, but make sure you don't forget on your next oil change to swap into your winter weight oil. The breather tube, a lot of aircraft have a crankcase breather coming out of the bottom of the cowl. And in summer, that's typically a non-issue, but in winter, even taxiing in snow can push a lot of snow up into the breather crankcase tube and potentially close it off with some icing. That tube can also get quite humid on its own without any external moisture added. So you want to make sure that you aren't getting your breather tube frozen. Make sure that your breather tube is free of ice in the walk around, as the last flight it could have frozen up. And if it is iced up, thawed out appropriately. You want to also inspect that your hose clamps, hydraulic fittings, hoses, and seals are all secured and not cracked as well. As we know, metal and rubber particularly can fatigue quite drastically in cold. And with the vibration of the engine, if one of those tubes is cold, and with the vibration, it could have cracked, and you could be leaking, especially hydraulic fluid. You don't want to be leaking hydraulic fluid in flight. Your cabin heater. A lot of light aircraft can be. A lot of aircraft have the heater muff type heater that pulls off of. It's a shroud around your exhaust tubing. And so by design, you're not drawing your exhaust into the aircraft. The exhaust is heating the air that's in that shroud, and then that's drafted into the cabin. A lot of airplanes now with those shroud type heaters have an airworthiness directive for that heater muff to be inspected, as if there's a crack in that internal exhaust pipe that's around the shroud, or sorry, inside the shroud. You could be sucking in some exhaust into your cabin, and therefore some carbon monoxide. So I would highly recommend that you carry a carbon monoxide detector, either one of those little placards that you can get from ASA that has the circle in it that you just look for the black spot, or get a digital one that provides you with an alarm. If you fly a Garmin-equipped aircraft, a lot of those G1000s or the G3X Touch have a CO detector in it that'll give you an annunciator on your PFD. Control cables, obviously metal expands and contracts with temperature changes. So make sure that your control cables are properly tensed and adjusted to compensate for changes in counter. We had an instance the other day with an aircraft that I was flying where the cables were too tight and we had to take it to maintenance and have them removed. It was about 20 pounds of pressure, I believe, to roll the ailerons before the adjustment. Aircraft batteries should be fully charged. No different than car batteries. They are, again, susceptible to increased load during cold weather operations. Consider using a battery warmer or battery blanket to keep the cold cranking amps appropriate, as warm batteries rather give better cranking power. Understand what battery you carry. A lot of aircraft batteries are moving towards lithium batteries, which are more susceptible to cold rather than the wet cell batteries that are traditionally installed. Into wheel pants and pants, sometimes called speed fairings. They are installed to give a marginal increase in your true airspeed. I believe on the 172s that we fly at work, it's about 2 to 3 knots, depending on the model of the aircraft. A lot of guys believe that their aircraft just looks better with wheel pants or without wheel pants, but it's recommended that in winter you remove your wheel pants. It can be a problem in the summer too if you're landing on a grass strip or unprepared strip where your wheel is pulling some debris into the wheel pant. But in winter, that debris can typically be snow, and with your braking after landing, that snow can melt and can cause some problems on both your axle and the braking. For aircraft with retractable gear, if your aircraft performance allows, you could delay retracting the landing gear for up to a minute. And what that does is it helps the gear with the ram airflow to remove any debris out of the wheel and the brake before you retract it. As with a retractable gear, when you have a frozen axle, if you bring it up, and especially if you have closing gear doors on your mains, that frozen substance can then contaminate not only the wheel itself, but also the traction mechanism. This is a short video from Casera and Smart Pilot on tips for cold weather pre-flights.
I don't think we're getting any audio, Ronan.
Is the audio not playing there?
I don't have it on my end.
Anyone else getting audio?
Yeah, we're getting a few comments.
Okay. Then we'll skip. There's a few videos in here in the slide decks, but we'll skip over those today. But essentially there it's talking about looking for that oil breather tube being blocked or checking your winter fronts. Also, a lot of aircraft use the cowl blankets that you drape over the cowl or cowl plugs. If you are using the cowl plugs, I would recommend that you can get a couple from your craft spruce that are fitted to your aircraft, but they have a little flag that sticks up over the cowl. I've seen many people start their airplane with these cowl plugs in at some airport, and the cowl plug comes flying out of the cowl with the prop spinning. So make sure you have some visual, even if you don't have cowl plugs with a flag, give yourself a visual in the cockpit, maybe a post-it note over your magnetos to say plugs installed. In terms of winter pre-flight tips, avoid a start below -7 without preheat. Like Chris was saying, you can have Wi-Fi plugs put into your hangar or Bluetooth plugs that you can, before you go to the airport, you can start the preheater on the aircraft. Zero surface contamination. Again, we'll get into that in a little bit here, but adhering to Transport Canada's clean wing concept is critical. And check that every surface, your ailerons, elevators, wheels, cowl flaps, rudder, any other speed brakes, any surface that you have that you'll be using in flight, make sure that you're able to move them through their full range. In terms of something like speed brakes, make sure that you're able to deploy them through their full range. Even if the surface itself is clean, the control cable channels could have some ice or anything built up in there that could restrict movement. Again, check that oil breather that's clear of ice. You want to make sure that your crankcase is able to expel any of that moisture that develops in it. A lot of aircraft, particularly radial engines, recommend that you pull the prop through a couple turns before you start. My advice would be to follow both the aircraft and the engine manufacturer's recommendations when it comes to turning the prop through before the flight. Some aircraft, the Seneca FLI at work, it does recommend that we pull the prop through, I think it's 6 blades before starting when it's too cold to get oil moving through the cylinders in the crank. But other aircraft, our 172s, do not recommend pulling the prop through and letting the oil turn naturally through the engine. So always follow your manufacturer's recommendation with that kind of thing. Don't just go off word of mouth and say that's a good idea. De-icing. Great image there. It looks almost like it's in Calgary. Any frost, snow, ice developed on a surface will cause a severe degradation in lift and a major increase in drag. I believe the Transport Canada research came out to be it's a 40% increase in drag and a 30% decrease in lift. Even having a minimal amount of frost somewhere on your wing can decrease that lift. And it can also cause flight control issues if you have frost adhering to the wing ahead of an aileron, for example. The airflow over that aileron could be disturbed and not give you the full control input that you're expecting. Either if you're faced with airframe icing and wing contamination, when you get to the airport, either go home, save it for another day, or spend some extra time in the pre-flight removing frost and snow. Best recommendation to clean up your airplane is to park it in a hangar and let the frost melt off naturally. When doing that, just because the frost is melted or the snow's melted, if you have water on the wing after it's melted and you pull the aircraft out again, you're going to put yourself in another icing scenario. So pull the aircraft in the hangar, let the frost and stuff melt off, and then take a towel or something, clean up the rest of the water and make sure that your aircraft is totally dry and that there's no risk of refreezing. A lot of people have used brooms in the past in lieu of de-ice fluids. Make sure that it's a soft broom. You don't want to scratch your surfaces further by using a stiff broom. If you are using a stiff broom, you can put like a towel or something under it to help soften the blow. Make sure that you aren't using a broom or any scraper on any glass on your windshield or anything, because those little plexiglass windshields that are present in a lot of aircraft are quite susceptible to damage. Even if you're cleaning it with a shop towel and you have a little bit of sand on your shop towel, you'll get a lot of scratches out of that. Often, if there's snow on your wing, there's ice under the snow. Removing frost and ice can be a lot trickier than just sweeping off snow. But the best tool for your frost and ice is a heated hanger with a little bit of time. When you are melting the frost and ice, make sure that the water that's residual after melting, it doesn't get into your flight control hinges where it might refreeze and cause stiffness in your controls. That's another video that I'm going to skip. If you are able to have de-ice fluids, make sure that you understand the limitations of that fluid. A lot of de-ice fluids have something called a holdover time guideline, where that fluid is only good to stay on your wing for half an hour before the fluid itself becomes ineffective and then becomes a icing risk in itself. Glycol or a type 1 solution is the most expensive solution in Canada. Generally only available at an FBO or an airport that supplies de-icing. You can get both fluid and spray equipment from a supplier like Aircraft Spruce. But again, make sure that you're using the fluid and the equipment as prescribed by its manufacturers. Oftentimes you can put a little bit of type 1 fluid in one of those pesticide sprayers that you use in a garden, a little pressure can with a hose, and that works quite well. Um, but again, make sure that the solution you're using it properly and that's effective for your aircraft. Another video on frost there. In terms of de-icing considerations, you as PIC are responsible for your aircraft in all phases of flight. That includes the pre-flight phase. You must, as PIC, coordinate with the de-ice personnel, or if you're de-icing yourself, that removes that consideration. Do not spray your engine inlets and windows, as the glycol itself it can be hard to see through, and it's not great for the engine to ingest. It's meant for flight control only and surfaces. You should be pointing your aircraft into the wind, ideally. A lot of airports can be tricky to move your aircraft into the wind, but that ensures that the fluid is not coming back at you as you're spraying. Where on the aircraft fluid application should begin, a lot of fluid manufacturers can specify that you need to start on the left wing, for example. If it's not specified anywhere, you should be starting, your first surface that you spray should be a surface that you can see from the cockpit. So the leading edge of your wing, if you fly a high wing with a strut, spray the underside strut. The reason being is that when the fluid fails, it'll fail in the order it was applied. So if you spray front to back on the airplane, then the front side of the airplane is going to be the first to fail. And you want to make sure that the first to fail surface is visible from the cockpit so that when you're taxiing or you're departing, it's a quick look out to a surface that you can see from the cockpit and you can see if your fluids is refreezing. You want to brief between you and the de-icer prior to fluid application, how it's going to be applied, where it's going to be applied, what fluid is applied, and the applicable holdover time guideline for that fluid. In terms of GA aircraft, if you're looking for another solution, polypropylene ice or antifreeze could work. Automotive windshield de-icer also works, and high concentration of rubbing alcohol also works. The polypropylene antifreeze is pink. It's commonly used on RVs and boats. If you put that in a pressure sprayer like you use in the garden for pesticide, it works quite well. Whatever fluid you use, avoid using a cold fluid. At least make sure it's room temperature. If you keep it in your garage, if you don't have a heated garage, it can be colder than freezing. And a lot of these are designed to not freeze. If you spray a warm fluid on a wing with ice or frost adhering it, it's more effective at melting that ice. And a lot of those type 1 fluids are only valid, their holdover time is only valid if it's applied heated. Where are we at here for time, George?
Yeah, let's have a 10-minute break. Obviously we've got a load of different time zones going on here, but if you join 5 minutes past the hour, we'll continue. See everyone then. Thanks, Ronan. Great. I hope everyone has had a nice break and done everything they need to do. So back to you, Ronan.
Sure. So getting into snow-covered airports here. Contaminated surfaces, you are likely in winter going to be parking, taxiing, taking off, or landing on a contaminated surface. And a airport surface is considered contaminated whenever there's standing water. Sorry, that's my little brief timer there. Whenever there's standing water, ice, snow, slush, or frost, anything on the surface, it's considered contaminated. And any degradation in a contaminated surface would be slippery, even if it's just a little bit of water. In recent years, Canada's changed to the RSC NOTAM versus NOTAM J's, and this is a little bit different than the states. They call them SNOTAMs down there. But ICAO had a new global reporting format, which Transport followed with CRFI. RSC NOTAMs are a little bit different. I'll show you some examples in a couple slides, but we now report runways in thirds rather than the average across the full length. There's also a new runway condition code that's included in there. The term bare is no longer used. And a maximum of 2 surface descriptions can be reported either per third or for the full runway length. A runway is reported dry only under certain circumstances. Dry is no longer reported if there's any other contamination on the runway. When we're talking about the runway in thirds, we have the touchdown, the midpoint, and the rollout third. This better describes the condition of the runway, as if only the first 2/3 of the runway is plowed, then the last third is going to have a slightly different report. So here we see the NOTAM differentiating between the 3/3. So if I go into my pointer, there we go. The first third of 07 is condition code 5, and the last 2 are 3, with the first third having half of the third with 1 inch dry snow and 25% compacted snow. So in this case, I would assume that the compacted snow is lower in the cross section of the snow, with the 1/2 inch or the 1/8 of an inch dry snow sitting on top. The midpoint is 50% compacted snow and 50% 1/4 inch dry snow, and the last third being 25% compacted snow and 25% 1/4 inch dry snow. So here we're missing 50% of the last third. Same thing in here, and here we're missing 20%. So that 20%, 25%, and 50% in the last third would likely be considered bare and dry, or bare under the last structure. The runway condition codes relate to the runway condition code assessment matrix. And unfortunately, this is kind of buried in some advisory circulars, also in the AIM. But the best case scenario that we could have is the condition code of 6, and that indicates that the runway would be dry with minimal braking degradation. Condition code of 5 would still have good braking with directional control, and it's generally relating up to 1/8 of an inch of contamination. With a condition code of 4, we start to get some more degraded braking, getting into medium. 432 is medium, with 2 being medium to poor. 1 is poor, and 0 is no braking experienced. If you guys want to look into the runway condition codes and a little bit more into RSCs, it's in AC 700-057 or AC 300-19. CRFI, again, going back into some PPL, CPL type ground school stuff. If we go back a few slides to the example here, we get the CRFI on 07 reported at -3 degrees of 0.4, 0.32, and 0.3. So taking the lowest experienced on there, that's what I would take. You could average them, but I would also go with the lowest case scenario, get 0.3. If you're trying to figure out the maximum crosswind that you would be able to handle on this runway, you would take the CRFI on the bottom here of 0.3 and follow it up to the 10-degree line there. So if your winds were maybe 20 knots at 30 degrees off, that would be okay. But 20 knots at any more than 30 degrees off the runway heading, you'd start getting, more than 20 degrees off, you start to get more slipping action, less controllability on the runway. With the CRFI, 0 meaning no braking and 1 meaning all the braking you can have, obviously 0.5, there would be 50% braking. CRFI is published at the back end of a RSC NOTAM. Typically, runways in excess of, I want to say it's between 3,000 and 5,000 feet, you get the reporting in thirds, but sub 3,000 feet, you get 1 indication for the whole runway. And when they take that 1 indication for the whole runway, that's them taking the average. If they didn't record a CRFI indication, then you get an NR, not reported, in the CRFI section. If you're at an airport with taxiways that have been plowed or have contamination on them, you may also get a RSC condition for taxiways and aprons. So again, knowing the aerodrome that you're operating into, if you're operating into Calgary International versus Calgary Springbank, you're going to get 2 different reports and 2 different styles of reporting. All NOTAMs are required to publish the RSC format, although some aerodromes may not record CRFI, they may not record the third, they may take the average. So it's important to understand how that airport is recording their RSCs. In your ATIS, when you're listening into the arrival ATIS or the departure ATIS, you would start to hear the RSC NOTAM verbalized. So exactly how you'd read it out is typically how it comes out on the ATIS, with the condition codes being reported here. So at Springbank, I want to say most days it comes out condition code 666. So again, variations within it. You can have RSC and CRFI by thirds, where here you have 533, and then it gets into each thirds condition with 3 different CRFIs. You could also have the full length averaged. So for 725, most of the runway has 50%, 1/8 dry snow, 25% compacted snow on 160-foot width. So this might have been a 200-foot wide runway that they left 40 feet unplowed. And then here you only see 1 CRFI report. Or you could have any combination in there. When you're going into CFPS, this is how the RSC NOTAM would look like. CFPS is the new AWWS. The initial section is the RSC section, with the back half being the CRFI section. And that's where you would see the taxiway and apron information. Compared to a NOTAM J, it's a lot easier to read. It's a lot more broken out. And in terms of briefing it, it's a lot easier to read and understand. If you're only using 1432, you don't need to go through the whole NOTAM to find the 1332 section. You can just find it's a little bit more segregated out there. We also segregate the CRFI and the remarks section a lot better. Although the formatting changed a little bit, the content really hasn't changed. You're still getting the gist of what's on the runway. It's just laid out a little bit simpler. It's also easier to see when there's 2 conditions reported for the same runway. They use the word and versus here they use a comma. They've changed to fractions instead of decimals, again, to make it easier to interpret. And we use full text now a lot more instead of the abbreviations for weather experienced. I'll leave this slide up here for anyone that wants to take a photo of it to learn more about the new changes. All right, moving on. For winter airport operations, if you're at an uncontrolled airport, it says to walk the runways and taxiways. Obviously, flying out of Calgary, I would not recommend walking on the taxiways. But something like Okotoks, for example, it would be pretty easy to walk out, if not on the runway, at least close to the runway, and inspect them for traction and snow depth before you take the plane out. Check for PIREPs. Sometimes at a larger airport that experiences commercial traffic, you'll get a PIREP for braking action. That can give you a good indication of the surface condition. Run-ups on slippery surfaces are not advisable for obvious reasons. Obviously, you don't want to run up your engine to 1800 RPM with your park brake set and still keep sliding. I'd also add to not do your run-up on a contaminated surface. Wherever possible, do your run-up on a cleared surface. If there's snow or something sitting on the pad, even if there's water. At work the other day, we had a theoretical discussion on how fast the tips of our prop move. We found at takeoff power, they're moving pretty well at 800 miles an hour plus. If you hit a drop of water or a couple snow grains, you can get that abrasion on your propellers. It can cause nicks and dents, and it can cause the same damage that a rock will cause. If you normally taxi at 10 knots, I recommend taxiing at 4 knots, 3 knots even. Keep your taxi speeds way lower than normal, especially when you're on a contaminated surface. Use aileron and elevator positions suitable for the wind, especially in tricycle gear airplanes. I've run into this with a lot of my students where they forget to put in their runway or the wind inputs for your taxiing. If you are taxiing on deep snow, I would treat that as more of a soft field taxi with your elevator full back, but obviously taking into consideration the conditions and wind that you're experiencing there, make the appropriate control inputs. Curve of snowbanks when taxiing. This is often an issue at small town airports where they have the town or the municipality do the snow clearing, and the plow operators used to using the plow on the highway where they can just leave a snowbank sitting there because there's nothing overhanging on the snowbank. But particularly when you're taxiing a low wing, you want to be cautious of how high those snowbanks are and where they're sitting. Don't ride the brakes. Not only is this bad airmanship on your airplane, but it'll also heat up the brake itself. And when snow or slush hits that, it'll melt into the mechanism. And then when you release the brakes, it'll freeze, which either locks them up or makes your brakes unusable. Watch out for snow removal vehicles and equipment. Most airports, they're pretty good about being on the radios and keeping the right of way to the airplanes. But at some airports, they might not have a radio or they might not know that someone's flying that day. So similar to when you drive a car, make sure that behave as if that guy doesn't see you. And treat arrivals at airports with unknown conditions as precautionary landings. And if you haven't flown a precautionary landing in the year, even simulated in the last year, I would say go practice it. It's a very perishable skill, and you want to make sure that you're able to fly it second nature. Of all my students, when I ask them when would you do a precautionary landing, they always say if I have an issue or I'm trapped in weather, I'm going to land in a farmer's field. But in my career, I've never done a precautionary landing to a farmer's field outside of the training environment. They've always been to an off airport or a backcountry strip where I'm not sure about the condition, or even like flying into Sundry or Olds where I'm not sure if the plow's been out or how good of a job the plow did. I'll do a precautionary and make sure that there's no snow on the runway. Another video I'll skip, but if you guys missed it during the break, someone found the YouTube playlist for all the the Smart Pilot videos. So there's a link floating around in the chat of all the videos that you can go watch after this. Key points out of this section: make sure that your airplane is set up for cold weather operations with the baffles installed if applicable. You're using the proper grade as recommended by both your airplane manufacturer and the engine manufacturer. Avoid over-priming and flooding during difficult starts. Over-primed and flooded starts are no fun during the summer, but let alone when it's cold and the engine's already not wanting to start. Don't make it harder on yourself. Idle at least 1,000 RPM to allow the proper warming. Again, this is something that you should be following your manufacturer's recommendations on, but at least 1,000 to get your oil pressure hot, or sorry, your oil temperature hot. And make sure that you keep an eye on your pressure and temperature during the warm-up. You don't want to see it spike too fast, but also if it's not rising, that could be indicative of a problem. Don't start your run-up until the temperature is green also. You want to make sure that your engine is at operating temp before you ask it to make power. So treat your engine with a little bit of care there. Check for carb ice. I'm going to add the word often into that sentence. Check for carb ice often, not just before takeoff, but also in flight. And keep in mind that not outside of winter flying, in the middle of summer, you can get carb ice too. Again, treating your engine with care. Don't go from idle to full bore in less than 2 seconds. Using your cowl flaps or power settings as appropriate to keep your temperatures in the recommended range. And if you're doing low power descents, try and clear the engine every 500 feet or so to make sure that you're treating that engine with a little bit of care and not shock cooling it. If you're practicing a forced approach in the winter, you want to make sure that you are using a higher power setting and appropriate flap setting to simulate the power off descent. Sorry if you hear the dog barking, I think Amazon just landed. But in terms of cruising in winter, we talked about a little bit of navigation. You want to be flying along roads. You want to be flying, if you can't follow a road, at least near civilization. Remembering that things look different in winter. In Canada, we got beautiful white covered landscape. So a lot of stuff can kind of blend in. Flying over a snow covered area on an overcast day especially can cause a bit of a whiteout condition. I was talking to my friend that flies at Stars the other day. He was flying out of Saskatoon and they entered whiteout conditions down near Swift Current. So super easy to encounter, and it's not reported in any weather product in Canada. So you want to kind of interpret the weather product to imply a whiteout condition and be prepared for that. Following a shoreline can have its advantages. Obviously, you've hopefully got a little bit of a beach or something there to land on if you need it. But it also gives you, again, that verifiable landmark to follow. Like I said, the overcast condition can cause whiteouts, but if it's not causing a whiteout, it'll reduce your contrast. There's less shadowing. So if you're looking for a hill, there might not be a shadow on that hill to point out that it's a hill. The 5 C's for lost: climb, conserve, circle, confess, and comply. So climb for better visibility and overview if you can, if there's an overlying ceiling. Obviously, don't go VFR and IMC. Conserve the fuel, get into that flight for best endurance, whatever power setting your POH suggests for that. Circle, try and figure out where you are before you put yourself in a new area. So find something near you that's verifiable out the window and on the map that you can use as a set heading point. If you're near an ATC service, say you're flying near terminal airspace, even if you're outside of terminal airspace, often the radar extends quite far outside. Or you can call Edmonton Center or Flight Information Service en route, and they'll be able to help you. Just a simple, hey, I'm lost, I need some help. They'll be able to help you out, hopefully. And then if you are in contact with ATC, comply with them. Flying near lakes, obviously we talked about some different weather that can happen near lakes. They're their own weather makers. So watch out, especially downwind of those lakes. If you don't have a night rating and you aren't night current, you want to keep in mind your sunset times. VFR into night, if you're not ready for it, can almost be just as bad as VFR and IMC. The moment you think, man, I don't know where I am, or maybe I won't be able to get into my destination, it's probably when you should start the dive route procedure. If you're thinking that you won't be able to get into your destination, the weather's getting bad up ahead, start the dive route before you're into that bad scenario. Again, don't make a hazardous situation worse by waiting too long. Whiteouts. I'll let you guys watch the video on your own there since there won't be any audio on it, but again, be cautious of that condition. Airframe ice. Good quote here out of Weather Flying. Immediately start working to get out of it. It really requires fast action and certainly never panic action, but it does call for positive action. Ice can affect your engine through the carburetor, your fuel injection air source, or the turbine air induction. So if you don't fly a carburetor plane, you're still susceptible to, it's called impact ice in that case. In terms of accidents relating to icing, it accounts for about 12% of total accidents. And in accidents where icing was listed as a cause, only 8% of that was reported as ground, with the majority of it being induction and the second most being structural ice. Once you see ice on your airframe, you become a test pilot, especially if you are flying an aircraft that is not FIKI or certified for flight into known icing. Do not fly into ice if you're not certified for it, if you don't have equipment for it. Typically, 3 types of ice you can encounter. You got rime ice, you got mixed ice, and you got clear. Rime ice is rough, milky white, generally follows the contours of the surface, and can be effectively removed by de-ice or anti-ice systems. Typically, this looks like frost forming, looks a little bit rough on your leading edge. Versus clear ice, usually contains a couple air pockets that give it a lumpy, translucent appearance. This is a lot harder to see in the airplane, and it's often characterized by seems to ripple back off the wing. It looks like you flew in rain and it froze. So you probably got a couple fingers of ice streaming back off your wing. Typically, it's a lot stronger than rime ice, which means if you have boots or wet wing or something, it can be hard to remove. If you have an aircraft with boots, make sure you're current on how to use those. A lot of guys will try to blow the boots early in the ice development, which a lot of aircraft recommend letting the ice develop to a point where you're almost uncomfortable with how much ice you have on your airframe before you blow it. And that's just to make sure that the boots are having a good effect on how much ice is sitting on the wing. Then you got mixed ice, which 9 times out of 10, if you're reading a PIREP about ice, chances are they're reporting it as mixed. Just because there will be some melting that will cause a clear ice appearance versus a rime ice appearance. The weight of ice can be a big issue. Doesn't look like it'd be a lot of weight on there, but frozen water can be a lot on an aircraft, especially if you're already at gross weight. Not only does this diminish the maximum lift capability of the wing, but it also will adversely affect the handling of the aircraft. Like I said, if you have on your wing there, if you have ice towards the leading edge near your ailerons, you'll notice that your ailerons become degraded. Ice accumulation no thicker or rougher than a piece of coarse sandpaper will reduce lift by 30% and increase drag by up to 40%. Larger accretions of ice beyond that sandpaper model will increase drag by 80% or more. Ice will form at a minimum of +2 degrees if you're in liquid water. It's not 0 because your wing will be sitting at 0 degrees at 2 degrees. So because of the ram airflow, your wing is cooling down. So even though you're in positive temperatures, your skin temperature could be low enough to cause icing. Ice isn't just encountered in cloud. There's also precip that'll cause icing, namely freezing rain, freezing drizzle, and ice pellets. Oftentimes this happens at a cold front where the cold air plows under warm air, which is typically more humid than the cold air that's underrunning it. And once that warm air rises over the cold front, you've got typically precipitation falling into cold air that'll freeze. In a warm front, the warmer air tends to slide over the cooling air, but the same thing happens where you've got precipitation falling into cold air, and in winter, often that cold air is in a negative temperature, which will cause some icing to build up. When you are looking at the weather map, try and get behind the front rather than fly in the front of the front. Generally, that precip will be at the frontal surface and not towards the rear of the front. So by flying kind of around the backside of the front, you're avoiding a lot of that high-risk precipitation. All in all, plan ahead and stay clear of cloud. If you're planning ahead, you're looking at the GFA and it shows some freezing rain, maybe not a good idea to go flying. And if you do go flying, plan ahead to get around that. Immediate is the word of the day, especially as a VFR pilot. When you encounter ice, the time to take action is when you get into the ice. The best action is often to take a 180-degree turn to get out of the situation. Typically, if you've encountered ice, that means there wasn't ice behind you, so start going behind you. Continental 3407 had a tail stall. If you guys remember from your PPL, CPL ground school, the counterintuitive, but the smallest surface on your airplane will get the most ice first. So most often the smallest surface on the airplane is the vertical and horizontal stabilizers. And that disturbed lift causes a tail stall, which your horizontal stabilizer is essentially an inverted wing, which means the recovery for a tail stall is typically opposite to a normal aerodynamic stall, where instead of pushing forward to break the stall and regain a positive angle of attack on your main wing, in this case, you're going to pitch up and deflect the elevator up to reduce the angle of attack on your tail stall. And here we see some of that degraded airflow in terms of the tail stall. On the top image there, you see the clean tail has attached airflow. And this is similar. If you flip this image upside down, it's pretty similar to what you'd see for your main wing. Here we see that ice is degrading the airflow over the bottom of the wing, or bottom of the tail, and that's causing the tail stall. When you deflect the elevator up, you're in essence making a flap onto your horizontal stabilizer that'll reduce the angle of attack on your tail. Typically, tail stalls are encountered at high flap settings when you're flying towards the high end of your flap extension range. So most 172s, you get full flap range at 85 knots. If you set 85 knots as your airspeed with full flaps with ice accumulated on your tail, you're putting yourself into a tail stall. Obviously, no stalls are good at low altitude, but tail stalls are especially dangerous when flying low. Induction ice is a big contributor. Like I said, if you're not flying a carbureted airplane, you're still susceptible to induction ice. Brief refresher from, again, PPL, CPL style stuff. At the bottom of the image here, you see the outside air being sucked into the engine air intake. Then it would flow through the carburetor. And in this case, what happens when carburetor heat is selected on, you open a butterfly valve that sends the exhaust from the engine into the carburetor. So you're supplying pre-warmed air into the carburetor that is then sent to the engine. Remember that flying a carbureted engine, when you have your carburetor heat selected on, your mixture is now more rich than it was before. So if you're flying with your carburetor heat on for an extended time, you may want to adjust your mixture control accordingly. For a fuel injected system, obviously nowhere in the schematic do you have a carburetor. So the induction ice source would be right against the ram air here. So if your ram air intake became congested with ice, you would have limited or no ram air to supply. Typically in this schematic, it's not well shown in this, but typically there would be an alternate air source. Typically, again, it's on the top of the engine, inside the cowl. And that just draws unfiltered air from inside the cowl. Yes, I like that comment. Avoid ice at all costs, even delay your takeoff. That's a good way of looking at it. A lot of guys, when you're kind of hanger flying, they'll often talk about ways to get out of ice, but not a lot of guys talk about how to not get into it in the first place, which not getting into ice prevents you from having to go through the issue of getting out of ice. Now getting into some winter survival kit stuff. Every survival scenario, you got to play the cards you're dealt. Obviously, it's not the situation that you wanted to get into that morning, but it's the one you're in now, and you got to get out of it. So start by dressing appropriately. If you want to make a bad day worse, you're going to spend your surprise camping trip freezing in -30. But if you're dressed warm, maybe you wore your snow pants on the airplane, you were in appropriate footwear, you brought your big winter parka with you, you got toques, mitts, the whole kit and caboodle, that survival trip is going to be a lot easier to withstand. That could be what you're dealing with out of the winter cross country. And when we talk about survival and survival preparedness, we often talk about the survival kit that we carry on board. And there was a great comment that came up in the chat over the break of making sure that your survival kit is applicable to the operation you're in. Obviously, if you're flying out to Calgary in December, you're not going to want a maritime tropical survival kit on board. That's not going to do you much good. Um, if you buy a pre-built kit, I would highly recommend that either you buy two or that you pay for the repack fee so that you're able to open it, see what's inside, and when you're looking at the contents, not just think of when would I use this normally, not the primary use of the item, but also a secondary use of the item. So if you've got rope in there, think of at least 2 ways, 3 ways that you'd be able to use that rope. Fire starters, same deal. You want to make sure that you are able to use everything that's in that kit, and often those pre-bought kits, while they are certified and they're good kits, you're often robbed of the experience of being able to use that kit. If you build your own kit, I'd highly recommend that you use a backpack, a waterproof backpack. Patagonia makes a really, really good waterproof backpack that's about, I want to say it's about 30 liters. And it is fully submersible. So again, if you find yourself sitting in water after your survival, you're not opening your fire starter and it being all wet. Um, Also make sure not just that your kit is applicable to your overall mission, but make sure it's applicable to the flight you're having today. So a couple of years ago, a good friend of mine and we flew out to Abbotsford to see the air show. Then we flew out to Tofino to go for tacos at Taco Fino. Then we flew back to Kelowna for a little bit of gas. And on that trip, I had to have a survival kit that encompassed both mountain flying, prairie flying, and maritime flying. So on that kit, I had a little bit of marine water dye that you see mostly search and rescue technicians use for when they end up in the water. They can put this in the water; it makes them more visible. A couple flares to hold up, and a PFD. But then in the mountain side of the kit, I had a lot of fire starter. I had a lot more water with me. I had a lot more food with me than I would normally carry. So that's where the benefit of building your own kit. It's modular in that sense where you can build it to the flight you're having today. After the crash, um, your survival is 80% mental, and the other 20% is in your kit and your skills. So that 10% of your skills, you could have that covered. Same with your 10% of equipment. You can have that whole 20% covered if you build your own kit or if you have a pre-built kit, if you know the contents of the kit and how to use it. To deal with the mental aspect of it, you got to give yourself a goal. You got to say by sunset, I'm going to have my shelter built. By morning, I'm going to have my fire running all night. Or by noon today, I'm going to find a water source. Give yourself those little goals. And it seems kind of silly sitting here on Teams talking about it, but when you're sitting in the forest and you say, okay, by midday today, I'm gonna go find water. It gives you something to look forward to and a task to accomplish, which is both good for your um, survival aspect to give yourself those little tasks. You're constantly working on surviving, but also when you accomplish those tasks, now you have a good mental state of I'm actually doing something that's helping me. Number one enemy is yourself. Number two is injuries. Number three is the temperature. And number four is disease. So obviously, if you're sitting in the forest and likely after a crash or some sort of injury, maybe some open wounds, that would cover off number two and four. Temperature in winter, I'd rank that higher on the list, especially flying in my area out in Western Alberta. We get into some high elevations that overnight could drop down to as low as minus 50 if I'm just happen to be flying on that cold day. But overall, the best survival tool is your own mind. So again, making sure that you have those goals, that you're reaching those goals in your survival set, and that you are not getting into the mindset of I'm not going to be found, rather finding ways to be found. Finding an open field to go pitch a fire in instead of in the middle of a forest makes you more visible. So yeah, make sure that you are both making goals and working towards attaining them to help your mental state. Do not leave the airplane unless you have valid reason to. If you can see a house that you have reason to believe there are people in that house, then okay, go to that house. But 9 times out of 10, if you're sitting in a field, we are looking for the airplane, not you. When search and rescue comes out, they're looking for the ELT, they're looking for the airplane. There was a good example of that. I want to say it was in Whitehorse, somewhere in the Yukon, where a plane crashed just shortly after takeoff. And the passengers had a little meeting at the wreckage and said, okay, we've got to be close to the airport. We're just going to pick a direction. One guy went north, one guy went west, the other went east, and the other went south. I want to say the two that went south and east were found relatively quickly, but neither of them found the airport that they were looking for. The one that went west was found in a field, barely hanging on, and the guy that went north was found 3 weeks later, unfortunately deceased. So stay near the airplane because that's what search and rescue is looking for. It's also a great resource. You've got fuel for fires. If you're flying in winter and you have cowl tents, then you've got essentially tarps, insulated tarps, to make a shelter out of. In this case, with that photo of the aircraft there, if I had a wing cover on or a cowl cover on board, I would hang that over the top of the wing there, and I've just given myself a really good shelter under that wing. Be careful though if your aircraft is leaking fuel or oil, or if there's risk of fire. Obviously, you don't want to be staying too close to that airplane. Another video on winter survival that you guys can watch after. Overall, though, winter flying, as much as I tended today to look at the negative aspects of it and what you got to be careful for, it is great flying. You get a lot of performance out of your airplane that we really don't get to experience over the summer. But with the right planning and the right attitude, it's a great way to get out and use your airplane and your license. So with that, George, I don't know, I haven't been watching the chat too closely. I don't know how many questions we've got in there, but we've got a little bit of time here for some comments and questions.
I've got a few that I've saved. I've been trying to put the video links in as we go along, but I've just included the playlist of all of the videos that are included. Yeah, so thank you very much for that, Ronan. Any questions people have? We have the Q&A section. We have the chat. I'll rattle off a few now. What is the USA using for RSC? Which system?
I'm not 100% clear on that. I haven't done a lot of flying stateside, but it is similar to the NOTAMJ. But the US is an ICAO state, so I'd expect that they're following a pretty similar setup to what Canada's following.
Awesome. Next one, can we discuss shock cooling in the circuit for landing?
Yeah, so that's actually a great point, especially when we are like in a training environment practicing power off 180s and stuff. From the downwind, we're sitting about 2200 RPM, and then we bring the power to idle. So when you're setting up to land at a circuit, just be cautious and, again, moving the throttle too quickly to cause shock cooling or heating. I'd suggest bringing the RPM out maybe 1 to 300 RPM at a time and slowly decreasing your engine speed. Obviously, there's going to be times where you can't avoid that quick power change. But wherever possible, try and be slow and steady with it. Make use of your flaps to manage your descent rates and speeds rather than making a massive power change if your aircraft is equipped with flaps, that kind of thing.
Excellent. Any tips for getting the oil temp into the green faster? The Bonanza takes a long time even after proper preheating.
Yeah, that often happens with a lot of airplanes that I fly as well. Follow your POH recommendations for getting the oil temp to rise. Once it starts rising, though, I would say you're safe to increase that RPM a little bit. So if your POH says to warm up between 1000 and 1200, once you see that oil temperature come off the stop, maybe run it up to closer to run up power and just make the engine make a little bit more heat to run the oil temp up. Also, you could close your cowl flaps if you're equipped with that, or manage your mixture a little bit to reduce the cooling that's provided by the fuel and cylinders.
We have a very good point from Alberta Regional Director Rob Japp. When you get a kit, use it first in a safe space, try it out, plan for the worst with friends, which is a good plug for Rob's survival that he does after the Red Deer Forestry airstrip. I think it's not running this year, but from personal experience, I took a pre-packed kit out. I tried using it to chop through a bit of rotten wood, and the handsaw I had snapped in half. So I'm glad I tested it out in that situation and not an actual survival situation. Some other good points here, what you're not carrying on you. Really good point. If you're thrown from the aircraft or the aircraft catches fire, it's good to have stuff to hand if you're evacuating the aircraft in a timely matter.
Yeah, exactly. So on Rob's point there and your point about your little hand saw snapping, I'd recommend if you're building your own kit, don't go to Canadian Tire to get most of that stuff. Canadian Tire has some good stuff, but a lot of it is kind of cheaper. If you go into a Cabela's or something, you'll get more purpose-built, a little bit more reliable equipment. And yeah, absolutely test it in a safe environment where you're not trying it for the first time. And on that topic of what you have on you, if I packed everything that I wanted to carry in a survival situation on me, I would never be able to fit in an airplane. So that stuff that you need to put in a kit, be conscious of where you put the kit in the airplane. If you're flying with your back seats empty, strap it to the back seats. Don't put it way in your aft baggage where it's going to be hard to access in flight.
Absolutely. Phil Lightstone asks any good survival courses we could recommend. I mentioned the one that Rob runs. There's some out east. Give it a Google. I think there's some really good ones out there to get out there and put some of this in practice in person.
Yeah, and even if it's not aviation specific, if it's not meant for pilots, you could still get a lot of good experience out of even some backcountry hiking type courses.
And again, the Smart Pilot resources, Ted Rankin, really useful stuff, great videos, some really great stuff he's put together. Got a question here. Can we have an update on the current ADS-B requirements? Class A and B. Basically, if you're flying above 12,500 feet, you need either a diversity solution, so that's an antenna on the top or the bottom, or a single antenna that can satisfactorily both reach the sky and the ground. CD&E at the moment is no sooner than 2028. So unless you're flying a little higher up, A and B, ADS-B isn't required for you for a while. Another question. I have electric
still
car
a good
pieces.
resource.
Oh, there it is. Gotta say,
Yeah.
ADS-B in if you're out in the middle of nowhere, or if you're in a congested area and you're not being given the separation that you would like, ADS-B in is a very valuable resource. Question here. I have electric car heaters brand new. Do they have the same effect of running rich as an airflow heater? Question.
Sorry, electric carb heaters?
Electric car heaters.
Can't say
Christopher
I've ever heard
Ball,
of those.
if you have any kind of further details, please drop it down in the chat. That's interesting. I don't know. Is that something you wrap your carb in?
Yeah.
Let's have a look. Good
Can't say
point
I've
here from
encountered
Grant.
those.
I wear a fly fishing vest in the plane, lots of pockets for survival gear and comfortable to wear. If I have passengers, it hangs off the back of the seat so they can take it if I'm incapacitated. Similar comment with a Canadian military helicopter vest.
Good ideas.
Canadian Forces manual down but not out. A little dated. Some pretty great illustrations. You can download the PDF for free online. Still an awful lot in there that's very valuable information for now. Andres has put a survival book in your pocket. Keep a lighter in your pocket. Someone also mentioned feather sticks. Good basic skills, little survival stuff. Flew with a spot tracker far north as a backup to the 406 since I don't have ADS-B out. Spot trackers are great, pretty proven. They've definitely worked for a lot of people, and they're nice and lightweight. Just remember to charge them, and remember to keep your subscription active, because if you haven't paid your subscription and you press the button, no one's going to come, unfortunately. Archie says always keep a Bic lighter in my pocket. Swam in a pool with one and it lights every time. That's an advert if ever I've heard one. Andre, I have an electric carb heater on a Jabiru. It goes with the carb as opposed to a specific engine. I guess we've got a. I think we've just been texted some extra information from a participant. Dave from Calgary says electric carb heat might not run richer because you're not pumping hot, less dense air through the carb. I do know with the Rotax 912, quick shout out to Chris, the 80 horse I had ran the coolant through the car body instead of pushing hot air through the inlet, so you didn't have as much of a performance drop. So Chris says the electric carpeter might have a better question for the first part of the seminar as I have a Rotax. Chris Horsten, if you are on, any comments on electric carpeters?
Yeah,
Oh,
that's
I
a
see
good
Chris.
question. I am on the probe that I'm familiar with screwed into the carb body. So whereas the water jackets tend to be just ahead of the intake into the carburetor, and so you're heating the air as it, the air is being heated as it passes through the jacket and into the carburetor. So that would, definitely result in some possible running a little bit rich. The electric one, the probe, I'm not sure. It depends how much it heated up that entry into the carburetor itself. If it did, then yeah, I guess it's going to heat up the air, and that's what's going to give you a richer mixture.
Excellent.
Does that make
Thanks
sense?
for that, Chris. Yeah. It's it's a good idea. It's a really good idea. We've got a lot of comments on Spot. I personally have a Garmin InReach. I keep it clipped on me. Um, really handy, especially out in the middle of nowhere. Any Q&As? Buying a safety kit from an aviation website, if that's what they specialize in. Again, I bought an aviation specific kit. Some of it was fit for purpose, some of it wasn't. Might be a better option in a better form factor.
I see one
But
there
Ronan,
from Dennis Fox about the ADS-B out for search and rescue.
yeah.
I don't think we have much that we can go off of ADS-B. More so would be the 406 CLTs when they activate, they send out a GPS pin. But they also provide, the ADS-B provides way more tracking data, even on a website, for the general public to view. But in terms of a search and rescue, I'm sure there's something I don't know about yet on how we can use it. What I will say, if you're using a Spot or an InReach, that you can get a public tracking link for. So if you're flying a link that you could text a friend to view, in the remarks comment of your flight plan, if you file online, it's super easy to put in. If you're flying over the phone, it's a little bit more of a hassle, but to file that public tracking link um, on your remarks section on your flight plan, because in the crash scenario, we are able to access that and find your last known location.
Just speaking to the ADS-B side of things, one of the intentions was that with diversity for nav was for search and rescue. They have, I don't think publicly, but they have in the past shown examples of using precise ADS-B data for the likes of search and rescue. Theoretically, if everyone has ADS-B, they can funnel the data through a computer which would look for anomalies and alert search and rescue before the likes of an ELT or someone waiting for someone that doesn't show up. Again, kind of unproven. It was one of the benefits that they kind of sell as an alternative to 406, but none of it's official at this point, and I don't think we'd see any official benefit from the likes of Nav Canada using ADS-B data officially for a while now. But again, as Ronan said, some pretty high quality positioning data comes out of ADS-B. So
And I
could
don't
be
think we'll see
useful.
a lot. I don't think we'll see a lot in the context of search and rescue until it becomes mandated for everyone. Because right now it's kind of case by case if the aircraft has it or doesn't.
You mentioned to watch for any jump in oil pressure during run-up. Can it be stressed enough as it indicates a plugged breather tube, which results in a blown crank seal, which equates loss of oil in flight? Tested one myself 3 decades ago. There's some really good first-hand experience in the comments here. Excellent. Well, we were a little bit over, so thank you everyone for sticking with us. I'm going to include Chris and Ronan's emails in the chat. Any questions, queries, anything further to this? Yeah, please reach out. I'll also include my details. So in the coming days, once I've tallied up everyone's attendance, I'll be sending out certificates via email. Any issues with that? If you don't receive yours, if I've made a mistake, please shoot me an email and we can get that rectified. Yeah, Ronan, Chris, any closing remarks?
Have a good night. Glad to be here.
Yep, same here. Have a great night. Thanks for coming.
Excellent. Well, thank you both very much for your time and for presenting. And yeah, thank you to all for joining us this evening. Have a good evening.